This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Good evening. Welcome to African Drums, the television organ of the Cuffy 250 Committee, an organization dedicated to the empowerment of the Afro-Guyanese community through education and the encouragement of self-activity. I am Elsie and I will be your host for this evening's program. Guyana marks its 45th anniversary as a republic. Coming a mere 4 years after independence in 1966, our Republican status was meant to deepen the meaning of independence, to make it more than a symbolic moment. Some criticized it as a partisan gesture aimed at buttressing the fortunes of the then ruling party. There has since been a debate over the contribution of our Republican status to the furtherance of democracy and nationhood. Today, we want to take a look at that very question. What is the state of our republic? And as we invariably do on this program, we also will discuss the role and contribution of African Guyanese to the republic. With me to do that are political activist and academic Mr. Aubrey Norton and cultural activist and educator Mr. Jonathon Adams. Mr. Norton, Mr. Adams, welcome to African Drums.
Thanks for having me.
I've had you both on the show before, so welcome back, I should say.
Thank you very much, MC.
Let me start with you, Mr. Norton. Explain to our audience what a republic is.
Well, I think you have to put a republic in the context of Guyana. First, Guyana was a colony, and as a colony, what you had was the British in charge of Guyana. And there emerged a struggle against colonialism in the 50s and 60s. The aim of that struggle really was to empower the people of Guyana, to rid ourselves of the colonial authorities, and to develop new structures, etc., to ensure we operated as a nation. In the early phases of that struggle, the British was not prepared to allow us to become a republic. So it was decided that independence would be granted in 1966. What independence in 1966 meant is that we had a prime minister, we'd already had internal self-government, we had all the government officials as local, but two important things continue to be controlled by the former colonial people. Now, those were: one, you had a governor general who was a titular head, but in large measure represented the Queen of England in Guyana. And the other fundamental feature of the society was that the final court of appeal was the Privy Council in England. So matters that had to be dealt with in Guyana the final place of appeal was the Privy Council. What that suggested is that we were seen as not capable of dealing with legal and other issues within our own jurisdiction with our own legal minds. It is those two that in the final analysis Republicanism will challenge. The then PNC government under Burnham had agreed at independence that once we got independence, a mere 4 years after, once you could have obtained 2/3 majority, which meant you had to get the support of the PPP, and it is well known the conditions that the PPP put to allow us to become a Republican country. And in 1970, the 2/3 majority was obtained, and Guyana became the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. What did republicanism mean in the Guyanese context? And notice I'm saying in the Guyanese context because I think republicanism will have significance for different people in different ways. Republicanism for Guyana meant that we have moved from a state where we had severed all the direct relations with the colonial masters. And I say direct because those who study neo-colonial theory will know that though you would sever them officially, the economic and other control that was exercised over the economy, etc., ensured that at the economic, political, and sometimes cultural levels, you were still in large measure manipulated and dominated by the developed world. So in real political terms, what it meant was that we're now going to govern our society with no direct political control, and that the attempt was to realize what is in our motto, the creation of a society in which there's one people who will come together to be one nation in pursuance of one destiny. In a nutshell, I would say that is what it epitomizes at the time, or epitomized at the time.
Okay. This question is for both of you. Most of the English-speaking Caribbean have opted to not become a republic. Tell us what are the benefits as well as the downsides of being a republic. Jonathon, do you want to start?
Benefits as against the costs of being a republic. I think some of the one of the benefits to becoming a republic is that one is able to pursue a path of development which is largely conceived by one oneself, and one has got an opportunity to break ties with that relationship, that dependent relationship that we had with the quote-unquote mother country, as they would have called it. And I think self-determination is one of the biggest offense. One of the downsides is that whereas we believe that we are totally free of the dictates of the colonial masters, that is not true. If one takes a look at the parliament buildings of Guyana, one is going to see above under the Guyanese coat of arms is another coat of arms, which one believes is the coat of arms of Britain. So that on one of the institutions which marks the democracy of Guyana, we still have that imprint of our interconnectedness with the colonial masters. Among other things is that one is able to pursue one's own foreign policy, and one of the benefits, the history of Guyana's foreign policy, which I think Aubrey would be able to masterly discuss, is one of, under Forbes Burnham, when we became a republic, is something of a mastery. Forbes Burnham decided that he was going non-aligned rather than go communist or the democratic free world capitalist rather than go capitalist. And it is very interesting to see how Forbes Burnham was able to chart a course for this nation through the Republican model and through following the paths of non-alignment. And so those are some of the I would say some of the benefits and advantages, and one disadvantage of being a republic.
Do you have anything?
Well, first of all, I would say the greatest advantage of being a republic is that you are really freeing your people to access their resources and utilize the resources in the interest of your own development. That is one of the positives that should really come from the republic. The second positive is that you would have had the opportunity to create a state apparatus that is controlled by the people of Guyana. It's another advantage. Now, another advantage of being a republic to me is that it allows your people to feel they are a people, that with dignity we're in charge of ourselves. Unfortunately, the Republic occurred in a context in which the world was dominated by the powers that be. I always like to make the point that nothing breaks from its past in totality. And to the extent that you cannot break from your past in totality, your past has the capacity to humbug your progress into the future. And probably one of the fundamental negatives of when the era in which we became a republic was that the domination of the past still existed, but the people believed they were free, and because of their perception that they were free, they blamed the government of the day for virtually everything that went wrong, not cognizant of the fact that some of the historical trappings were affecting the society. I'll give you a practical example. When you were a colony and sugar, rice and bauxite in doing well, the mother country in its own interest would help and create the conditions for you to emerge to perform the role that you wanted to perform. They want you to perform. When that no longer exists, well, you're left on your own and you get blamed. But what was responsible? What was responsible was the fact that Guyana was a virtually monocrop economy, or close to monocrop, 1 or 2 or 3 products at the most. And when those products were in trouble, bauxite, rice and sugar, Guyana was in trouble. And that has to do with your historical link. The other positive, I think, was that you were able to develop a foreign policy infrastructure. People who developed the skills to undertake your foreign policy, the Sri Ramphals of this world, the Fred Wills, the Rashley Jackson, the Lloyd Sewar, to name a few. So what in essence happened is that first independence and then republicanism allowed us to develop the skills that are required to conduct foreign policy in the international world. In fact, people argued at the time that Guyana exercised influence in the world way above its size. And so there are those positives. One of the fundamental negatives to me was that though you were supposed to be culturally independent and carving out your own culture, we became independent at a time when the international information order dominated small countries. It became worse with the coming of the internet. But in that early era, people still looked in other directions rather than looking at their own cultural development and to ensure. Look at how steel band nearly died in Guyana. Look at how in terms of calypso we didn't progress the way we should, and today we're just mimicking Trinidad rather than developing our own approaches, etc. So I would say it has its pros and cons. Fundamentally, however, I think that as it relates to the judiciary, we have shown that we can produce legal minds who can make sound legal decisions that don't only act as a precedent in Guyana, but act as precedents in the Caribbean. And there are a number of cases. Of course, unfortunately, our people at the time, a lot of them believed that the Privy Council was the best. You now see the Caribbean moving away from the Privy Council. But I think one of the seminal advantages and strengths was us moving to appeal court. That is not to gainsay the fact that there might have been intervention in the legal system and it didn't run as smooth as it should. There were problems with the legal system, but it showed that we had the capacity. I mean, it has gotten worse, where the legal system appears to be an appendage of the state and not solving some of the problems. So I think there were downsides and there were the positives.
Okay, now that we've gotten through the positives and the negatives of being a republic, what I want to know is, was the criticism that the move towards republicanism, that the criticism that it was driven by narrow partisan considerations, a justified criticism?
I don't think it was a justified criticism. There were changes which were taking place in the world. Britain was attempting to get rid of her colonies. They had become uneconomic to manage, and Britain did not want the burden of having to run these countries. Burnham himself said, when Chedi objected to us moving towards independence, towards us being free, Burnham said, whether we like it or not, independence is going to come, because the British do not want us as colonies any longer. So that in that particular context, there was no service, there was no self-service. In fact, if one wants to criticize the move towards independence and republicanism, it is that criticism is that it was a just thing to do, because all of the people who lived in this country at the time that we got independence and at the time that we became a republic were once free people. We were a self-determining people, and so that what we were doing was moving towards self-determination, but in a different context. When we lived in India, when Indians lived in India, there was a time when they were self-determined. When Africans lived in Africa, they were self-determined. When Chinese lived in China or Portuguese lived in Portugal, they were self-determined. And so all that we were doing is that we were getting an opportunity to become another self-determining people within the context of Guyana.
Okay.
I want to look at it first by understanding the state Guyana was in. When the anti-colonial struggle started, what was the position of the Guyanese? The position of the Guyanese was essentially at the bottom of the ladder. If you look in the banks, you didn't see Afro and Indo-Guyanese and Amerindians. If you went to teach, a lot of the schools were church schools and you had to be in a particular religion to be there. I grew up in Linden, where as a boy you couldn't walk into Watuka. Watuka was exclusively for the expatriates. We know the case of the sugar industry, where those foreigners who controlled the industry lived in the best houses, while the average Indian in the industry lived in squalor. So in essence, you had a situation in which the people of the country were second-class citizens. It is this situation where you were second-class citizens. There are cases where Guyanese came home, qualified from England in engineering, and couldn't get a job because of the color of their skin, and turned to law. There are numerous cases in the history of Guyana. So what in essence happened is that the people of Guyana were deprived of power in their own country. It is that attempt to get power so that the Guyanese people could be empowered and in charge of their society that made independence and republicanism a necessary struggle to achieve. And so one has to recognize here that essentially Guyanese was seeking emancipation. Though our own didn't come the violent way like many other countries, it was a struggle for the empowerment of people. So in my opinion, republicanism provided us the opportunity for Guyanese to be able to do the things that are required to make them into a nation. It is in that context Burnham in 1970 suggested a number of policies that he thought can empower our people. First, national unity, where he said that the society can't exist, you have to forge a nation. Second, non-alignment. he contended that in the world where the East and the West dominated, we had to pursue our interests. And therefore, we needed to make decisions based on what is in Guyana's interest. Then he suggested hinterland development. If you know what was happening in Guyana then, the hinterland was sparse. People from the coast had to get permission to go into the Rupununi and to Madhya, etc. And so Burnham felt that the real wealth of Guyana lied in the hinterland. Then Burnham also felt that historically we were involved in cooperatives, and the best way to forge the unity was for us to work together, and therefore he preached cooperativism. Burnham saw also that all the resources, the major resources, people forget that Burnham nationalized 3 institutions and the commanding heights of the economy was in Guyana hands. Bauxite, sugar, and what became GNICM, Sprostons. Just with those nationalizations, 70% of the economy came under Guyana control. What that means inversely is that while they dominated, Guyanese didn't own anything. And so it is that mattered. And then Burnham said that you couldn't develop by existing on other people. And so he developed the concept of self-reliance. That at the individual level, Guyanese must learn to rely on themselves, and that at the national level, Guyana needs to be self-sufficient, etc., and rely on itself. Now, I outline the policy framework to say this in answer to your question. If Burnham's interest was just personal power, as some people suggest, why would he have outlined 6 policies that were clearly intended to empower Guyanese? I mean, if it was just power, he could have gotten the power, outlined no strategies and policies to develop Guyana, and just control. So in my opinion, it is a short-sighted view that says Burnham was seeking just personal power. I say to you, every politician that I know of pursues power. The issue is not the pursuance of power, is what you do with that power when you get it. Who does that power serve? And my argument is that Burnham in power, in large measure, it served Guyana more than individuals. Don't forget, you know, you might be a young person, but when I was coming up in politics, we were told that Burnham was the 5th richest black man in the world. And they fabricated some story in some ebony that said that. Until day like today, nobody has ever produced the evidence. But the evidence was produced. At Burnham's death, when his assets were declared, he was no better off than the average man. Those who criticize him can't declare their assets. So I'm saying to you that Burnham was informed more by his philosophical belief, his ideology. And it is his ideology that said to him that, look, we can't be a socialist colony. Remember, Burnham was a socialist. He was saying that the privy councils can't be making decisions for us. They don't understand our culture. They don't understand our society. They sit in England and make decisions. We should make the decisions. Of course, because Burnham was president, that meant power to the state that he's in charge of. No one can gainsay that. But I do not believe that it was a pursuance of personal power. I believe it was pursuance of a vision. And in pursuance of that vision, there were positives, and I will admit, they were negatives.
I think I'd like to pick up on what Aubrey said and draw from something that he said earlier. He mentioned that there are continuities with the past, and one of those continuities that I would like to highlight was that of the society being an unjust one. When Burnham took power, the injustice in the society, and Aubrey pointed to the fact that Burnham, by nationalizing 3 institutions, took command of the economic heights, the commanding heights of the nation. It therefore meant that the commanding heights of the nation were in hands of persons other than Guyanese. And so that was part of the expression of the injustice in the society, because what you had was the repatriation of resources and profits away from the country. To deal with that injustice that lay in the society in the context of an international world which fostered that injustice, the leader of the nation had to be a strong person and had to give himself the capacity to do more than many others would, many other nations at that point in time would have been doing. In addition to that, Burnham faced an opposition to himself, not only his policies, to himself as being a leader. We know of the removal of the rice industry from the quarantine to Naikeri. We know of the burning of the sugar. We know of the floating away of the Demerara Harbor Bridge. Sometimes you used to find it in close to the Atlantic. I usually see jokingly, or sometimes you find it all the way up by Linden. What we needed then was a leader who not only had a vision, but who had the guts to go against the grain, and who had the humility to, in going against the grain, not discriminate against anybody in this nation. And so in that context, I think that there is a lot of unjust criticism of the kind of regime that Fox Burnham had in the society, which leads to some people saying that, you know, he was serving himself. I think Burnham served the people of this nation more than many who have come in his wake.
I want to make a quick point.
Sure.
One time I was at the Pegasus and a man was very critical of Burnham. So I engaged him in conversation. And I asked him, I said, what is it you dislike most about Burnham? He said to me, Burnham put ordinary children in the same class with his children at Queen's College. And it tells you the depth of the class barrier in Guyana. This man I'm telling you about is Afro-Guyanese, slightly fairer. But in his mind, it didn't matter to him if these people had the capacity to beat his child. What mattered was that his child was in a different category to the ordinary child. I say this to say to you, Burnham, through his policies, has removed a lot of barriers and created and reduced the gap in the society. Some will argue that he probably went too far. But I would say this, as somebody who come from a little place in Christianburg, where I born and grew up, and when you pass for high school, and $26 was the fee, the tuition fee for school, and people couldn't find the 26, not 26,000, $26. 26 Ghana dollars. Right. And there were students. I went to school with one of the brightest young men I have ever met. I tell people he beat me in mathematics every time. Used to beat him in other subjects. But this young man lived in Ituni and didn't have the resources to come to school. So he hardly went to school. Whenever he came, he did well. But couldn't afford to pay. And if you know Linden in those days, my father, like his father, wasn't working in the bauxite industry, so he couldn't get a scholarship. And what in essence happened is this brilliant brain didn't achieve. Had he come after 76, when you had free education and some other resources, I am dead sure he would have been one of the finest brains in this country. And I think people underestimate how the decisions in education would have equalized the society and give underprivileged children an opportunity that they didn't see before. That is not to say that there weren't problems in the education system. So I am of the view that education must always be accessible. That must be one of the hallmarks of our republic, but it must be quality education.
In fact, Elsie, before you come with your question, I'd like to leave the public with one test. Burnham has been dead 29 years now, more time than he ruled. But I challenge this nation to take a stock of the public inventory and show me where in the 29 years since Burnham has died that Guyana has been able to expand its public inventory. We have done nothing new since Burnham died. Nothing new. And that's a testimony to not only the vision, but the use of power of this man to leave a legacy which the nation has not been able to challenge 29 years after he shut his eyes.
Okay, we're going to take a step back a little. When you were speaking earlier, you made mention to cooperatives as a notion expressed in the policy of Burnham. Well, the official title of Guyana is the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. And I'm sure many people do not even understand what the Cooperative Republic of Guyana means. So can you tell us exactly what that means, and do you think that the institution and spirit of cooperativism has been enhanced over the past 45 years?
Let me jump over here.
Sure.
If you listen to the ads that are coming over that are advertising matrimony this year, you can hear that Guyana is the Democratic Republic. There's an ad which says Democratic Republic. There is a reluctance by certain reactionary forces, I call them reactionary forces in Guyana, to deal with the fact that Guyana has been named constitutionally the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. I challenge the notion that Guyana is a cooperative republic. We are not behaving like a cooperative people. And I believe that the reason why the cooperative, the concept of the cooperative is so much under pressure is because it leads one to take into consideration too much the contributions of African people. I'm a cultural activist, right? So I can get cultural. The greatest act of cooperativism was demonstrated by the Africans when they walked off of the plantation, when they bought Victoria, when they bought Plaisance, when they bought 188 approximately plantations in this country by pooling their resources. And that is how they were able to get around the limitations that were being placed upon them by the 217 years of enslavement, where they worked for nothing, and to get around some of the policies that were being put in place by the colonial government. And so that is my contribution to the concept of cooperativism.
Well, first of all, I think one has to understand in philosophical terms what Burnham meant. First, Burnham argued that in the history of Guyana, the cooperative spirit was always there in all ethnic groups. The concept of matrimony, you know, are Amerindians getting together after war cooperatively to celebrate. Indians have always had their way of cooperating, saving, helping each other. Africans have had Boksan and other forms of cooperatives. So cooperativism is a spirit of working together and cooperating to achieve common goals. Now, we need to draw a distinction between cooperativism as a spirit and a philosophy and the cooperative. When we start to talk about the cooperative, we started talking about the business. Now, people forget that some of the biggest companies in the world are cooperatives, though they're different from what Burnham was suggesting. Burnham was suggesting that people get together, form enterprises, etc. There are strengths and weaknesses in that which we don't have time to deal with. Now, I believe, or let me talk about the name of the country. The name of the country continues to be the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. And the government isn't stupid. They might play the fool, but they aren't stupid. if you see international agreements they sign as the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. Because the only legal entity called this country that exists is the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. Because after the constitutional reform process, where they were hoping to change it, they recognized they needed a referendum to change it. So it hasn't been changed. So they have, outside of the confines of the law, put under the ministers and so just the Republic of Guyana. They put on the passport the Republic of Guyana. It's a day when somewhere in the world, Barbados or somebody says, look, keep this passport. There's no country like that in the world. Because in real terms, in their attempt to get at Burnham, they've just become stupid. Now, having said that, I believe that the cooperative spirit is dying. And one of the reasons it is dying is because we are caught in a Western world, compounded with the failed policies of this government. You have a situation where people are scrunting to live and exist. And so it becomes each man for himself and God for us all. And I think in large measure that has eroded the cooperative spirit. But there are still a lot who operate cognizant of a cooperative spirit. Now, my own opinion is that Guyana is better off if it lives with a cooperative spirit. Because in a society where the focus is on self, there are always problems. So in my opinion, you must have a combination of self in the context of a cooperative society. I believe to the extent that we are a multi-ethnic society, the spirit of cooperating have got to be part of us if we are going to survive and progress. From that standpoint, I believe the cooperative is still a relevant idea. It is how we utilize it in the present context. The agreement that we just saw at the political level is indicative of the fact that if you cooperate and work together, you can achieve things. And so it depends on how you see cooperativism and the cooperative spirit. I still believe that it was an excellent idea for Guyanese to help each other to build houses in the form of self-help. I believe it's something we should go back to exploring, because it would help the small man to reduce his costs while at the same time getting his house built. You might be too young to know, but when Burnham came to power, one of the hallmarks of development in Guyana was that the state provided financial and other resources, and schools were built through self-help labor, which meant you didn't pay. Many communities didn't have to pay people for the labor, but the schools were built. So I believe there is a place for self-help and cooperatives, but it has to be done in the context of a modern, technologized world.
Okay. Many people are of the opinion that one of the biggest challenges facing the Republic is the issue of the Constitution. And they think that there needs to be a second republic that is based on a more democratic constitution that is aimed at stabilizing the country's governance structures and process. Do you agree? If so, what kind of constitutional reforms or changes would you recommend?
Well, Aubrey would be better answering this question, but I think I've alluded to my opinions on the powers of the executive.
Yes.
Lots of people are focusing on the powers of the executive. My fundamental argument is this. I use Aubrey's terms. There are continuities with the past. And Guyana is a society which came out of the injustice of enslavement, of colonial oppression, and also of internal sabotage. When Burnham took power in 1964, it was after the riots of 1963, the hurricane of protest, which saw unjustified killings on an ethnic basis. And what we needed was that we needed an executive with strong powers to arrest those kinds of negative behaviors that we were seeing. In addition to that, in addition to that, we came from different societies. And forgive me if I sound controversial here. Africans came from an egalitarian society. Indians came from a class society, which had the caste system as at its basis. Indians came here to challenge the freedom, were brought here by the European to challenge the economic freedom that Africans were attempting to develop. All of those negative objectives became institutionalized, and Burnham, when he came to power, had to attempt to forge a nation out of those contradictory forces. And so what you needed is that you needed an executive that had the capacity to challenge those negative forces.
So
I have a slightly different. Okay.
Just a minute. So are you saying that now that the dynamics have changed, there's no need for so much power vested in the executive?
I question even because I think that the injustice of the society, the injustice in the society, still remains. My opinion is that the evidence of that injustice in the society is, and here is where I'm focusing my argument, is the absence of Africans from the productive sectors. That's an anomaly. It does not fit in with what Africans did, and so we have got to ask ourselves, in a certain context, why is it Africans are absent from the productive sectors? And when we come to answer that question, when we come to the answers, we will see that it was because of the injustice of the society. My question is this: how are we going to correct it?
All right. In my opinion, one has to understand the ideology that informed Burnham and Jagan. Burnham was a socialist, Jagan a communist. Slight differences, they say. But one of the characterizing features of the Marxist-Leninist theory is control of the state apparatus to be able to operate in the interest of the working class. That is the claim. To the extent that Burnham was pursuing a socialist road, a lot of the thinking was to give power to be able to develop a socialist society. What kind of constitution we ended up with? We ended up with Burnham merging elements of Western liberal democratic thoughts with socialist positions. In the process, power became concentrated in the executive. The critical question to me is this: should we be ruled by man, or should we be ruled by law? I have a friend named Ronald Austin. In the days when we were Marxists and talking all kinds of theories, used to say, and I had agreed with him, that one of the weaknesses of Marxist-Leninist theory is that it relies on man and political party rather than law. Now, in my opinion, we can no longer sit back and hope for a political leader to come who will use the Constitution in the way that it suits all of us. Therefore, the solution really is to reform the Constitution, to let law take its course, so that man, be he president, prime minister, permanent secretary, or opposition leader, whatever, man must be made to operate based on the laws. To that extent, I agree there is need for constitutional reform, because we have seen, I mean, the classic case is the PPP criticism of the 1980 Constitution, but when they came to power, said it's a good constitution, because clearly they didn't want to be hamstrung by law. They want to rule arbitrarily. I believe the time has passed when we can allow arbitrary ruling. We need to develop a new constitution in which the powers of the president is restricted, in which institutions are governed by law and compelled to operate by law. And we need an effective judicial system so that when there are violation of laws, there are punishments. I mean, let us look at the 4.5 billion spending by the government. The truth of the matter is, the law says they can't. But because of the ideological background that they come from, they believe they can do what they like and goes ahead and do it. And because the issue has not been one that has been challenged in the court before, there is no clear approach on how it should be dealt with. So in my opinion, we have got to develop a law-driven society. Every man must be constrained by law and compelled to operate within the law. Because some of the people who you hear talking about rule of law, who you hear talking about what is just and what is unjust, if you put the power in their hands without law, they will behave just like those they criticize. So to me, the solution is in constitutional reform and having a society in which there are checks and balances and all and sundry compelled to operate based on law, including the police.
So how are we going to compel people to observe the laws when we have got this tradition of people ignoring the laws?
Well, that's what I'm saying. If you have a tradition of people ignoring the law and you get a new government, the first task of the government, in my opinion, is to establish that this will be a law-governed society, and whoever you be, wherever you are, if you're in violation of the law, will allow the police commissioner to let the law take its course. One of the problems we have is that over the years, the power of the commissioner of police has been eroded to the point that the commissioner of police, even though he knows he has the power to do it in law, he isn't sure how the politician will react. It is the politicians that will have to lead the way to say to constitutional bodies, you must operate based on the law. And when you operate based on the law, we will protect you and ensure that the law is maintained.
Which is nothing new, really.
So to me, there's going to have to be a change in the political culture. There will have to be an attitudinal metamorphosis as it relates to the law and the courts. And I don't see that coming without a new dispensation in which the people who are leading accept that the best thing for society is that it should be governed by law.
Well, I do agree with that, but I challenge the notion that that can be achieved with the diminution of the capacity of these public offices to act.
Well, it is not a diminution of power. It's a check on the power. They're two different things. I can reduce your power. I'm not reducing your power. I am putting mechanisms in place so that you use that power within the confines of the law. If you define that as reduced power, then the power should be reduced. The problem is you cannot allow people to operate based on what they think is right when they think it is right. People have got to operate based on clear laws. The laws must be known to you and me. Every citizen must know it. Take the police. Until you arrive at the point where the police understand that they are not a law unto themselves, and when they violate the law and abuse people, that they will be dealt with, they will behave the same way that they do. One of the sacrifices we have to make is to sacrifice some of the personal powers, etc., to ensure that the real power lies within the Constitution and the law, and people are compelled to operate within them.
And with that, I'm going to end this part of the discussion so you can get some more on being a republic and what it means. Let's turn our attention to African Guyanese and the Republic. Has the Republic been beneficial for African Guyanese? I know you mentioned the fact that African Guyanese seem to be absent from the productive sector of society. Can you explain that and give some benefits?
Well, you see what happened immediately after apprenticeship was over in 1838. Africans recognized that they had to empower themselves economically, and they proceeded to begin to buy villages and to take the lands in those villages and make them into productive uses, primarily abandoned cotton estates and some sugar estates. What subsequently happened is that the colonial government unleashed a cocktail of measures which included sabotage, terrorism, economic terrorism, military state terrorism, use of the combined court and the court of policy to block activities by Africans to develop those what we now term villages, but which were really cooperative enterprises, into financial estates. Walter Rodney assesses, and this is we're talking about massive amounts of monies which were being spent, and massive amounts of monies which represent opportunities lost in terms of business. Walter Rodney assessed that between 1838 and 1850 we spent $2.5 million to buy 25 of those 188 estates. Now what Professor Beckles and Professor Vereen Shepard are using is a factor of 10,000 to multiply any value in those days to understand just how much money was being spent. So you multiply that $2.5 million by 10,000 and you get an idea of just how much money our foreparents spent. By the time independence had come around through immigration and the colonial effort, Africans were pushed off of those lands, using those lands as productive bases. Independence came, and then came the government taking over the commanding heights and trying to make the society an egalitarian one. To cut a long story short, the reality is that we are not there in the business sector any longer, and that the history shows that it is an anomaly and it is an abnormality. Has the Republic served to correct that? If it was there before independence, and we're in 45 years of the Republic and it has not been corrected, then the Republic has not served the economic emancipation of Africans.
I hold some slightly different views.
Okay.
I believe you have to understand each ethnic group in the way they evolve. Let's take Linden, a bauxite industry in which most people were dependent on the bauxite industry. Their orientation is towards working in the bauxite industry. Simultaneously, black businesses emerge in Linden. I think we have got to remove a psychological barrier. I don't know if I'm using the right term. I tell people I grew up in a shop. My father had a shop. But my father never one day said to me, son, transform this business into a bigger business. My father's mantra to me was take education. Get education. Your way to emancipation is education. And I believe it was a correct mantra for my father and the Afro-Guyanese to say to their children, take education. But I believe they also made a mistake. I say to my children, take education, but find business to get involved with. Because what in essence happens is you might be educated, but if you don't have the financial base, you're still dependent. So one approach I think is that the Afro-Guyanese, in my opinion, have got to change their vision of progress and development. Progress and development must be both education and becoming involved in business, so you create an entrepreneur class. Now, when you look at the Indo-Guyanese community, if you look at the areas they go to in the University of Guyana, you see a lot of the African-Guyanese in social work, political science, international relations, etc. the hard focus of the Indo-Guyanese communities in the natural sciences, technology, and whenever you see them in the social sciences accounts, in large measure. There are cases. What does that say? It says that a lot of the Indo-Guyanese community focuses on careers that will allow them to be independent. The only career that African Guyanese in large measure really pursued to make them independent was law, which is field. So I believe we also have got to refocus our young people on science and go into the kind of career that allow them to develop. Now, that is at the individual level. At the individual level, I believe the African Guyanese has to develop his vision of how you will be empowered and pursue that vision. At the level of the state, I would put it in eras. Burnham, I believe, wanted to empower African Guyanese. And I use the case of saltfish. All Guyanese were taught to make saltfish when saltfish was banned. But whether we like it or not, the group that transformed it into an industry and exporting it in large measure, the Indo-Guyanese. And here, I'm not anti-black. I'm making a fact. Where does the solution lie? The solution lies in us developing a business ethnic in the African Guyanese community. I believe the state apparatus, particularly under Burnham, created conditions for the African Guyanese to progress. One of my criticism of the Burnham era is that I think you try to put people into business, etc., without the requisite tools. My criticism of the PPP is that it is in a conscious way put all the blocks you can find in the way of African Guyanese developing business. You just have got to look what happened in terms of contractors. When the government changed, there were a certain amount of African Guyanese contractors, a certain amount of Indian Guyanese contractors. In large measure, the African Guyanese contractors have evaporated, except they decide that they will support the PPP and go and get the dribblings. So to me, this is a complex issue. This is an issue that has a lot of dimensions that we have got to address. And so I don't want to conclude on this issue. I believe we have to do a lot more work, and to do a lot of work in terms of getting the African Guyanese to develop a business ethic and to become involved in entrepreneurship.
Okay. So we just have a few more minutes left on air, so we're going to try to get through as much of the discussion as possible. The Republican status is tied to the famous 1763 rebellion. Mr. Adams, can you tell us what is the significance of 1763 to our nation in a minute?
Well, 1763 represents the first African state in the quote-unquote New World. It preceded Haiti. And here is where I tie this into the republic again. I think that the republic has got a false consciousness. Guyana has got a false consciousness. And that consciousness comes about because of a false telling of the history. If the republic is to be healthy, then the efforts by the other ethnic groups to destroy the 1763 rebellion has got to be brought to the fore, and we have got to discuss it. The role of the Amerindians in putting down 1763, the role of the Amerindians in putting down 1823, the role of the Indians in destroying the African entrepreneurial movement has got to be discussed for the republic to be healthy. But I mean, we can't discuss it one, I mean, we gotta come back.
I agree with him to a point, but I believe at this stage in the Guyanese history, what we have got to do is the African Guyanese have got to develop a clear vision of where it needs to go and bring that vision to the fore at the level of political power. And as we discuss and move forward, ensure that there are clear measures to facilitate the African Guyanese and the Amerindian. I won't bring in the Amerindian here. In large measure, we have not done enough to transfer the Amerindian community into self-sustaining, proud communities. The development policies in recent times have made them dependent. And I believe that new policies should be structured to be able to develop a larger African entrepreneur class and an Amerindian entrepreneur class. Because I move from the standpoint that in any society where some are vulnerable, the entire society becomes vulnerable. And so for me, it is for us to develop a paradigm that permits us to ensure that all the ethnic groups in Guyana are sharing in economic wealth and all other aspects in life, so that all of them, the insecurities are removed from the society, and there are insecurities all across.
Okay, well, we're talking about the different communities within Guyana and their contribution to Guyana. Let's talk about the contribution of African Guyanese. What contribution did they make, major contributions to economic life in Guyana?
Let me give you a couple of names. Molly Archer, Maria Grant, Catherine Thom, John Griffith of Plaisance and Europe of Buxton, and also to James Jupiter Blucher Dorset, Hector John Webster Ogle. These are unknown names, but these are Africans who walked off of the plantation, who have left a legacy for the Republic. Molly Archer, Maria Grant, Catherine Thom, these were three women who participated in the purchase of Victoria. Dorset and Company, they established the fight for representation, because when the governor attempted to tax them without their involvement, they decided that, well, we're not having this. These were from enterprise. And so they established the need, or they demonstrated the need for Article 13. John Griffith and Europe from Buxton were denied their application to the Court of Policy for a loan to develop their estates. They showed the need for the country to proceed or to develop along economic lines, and they were willing to do so. They were the forerunners of free enterprise in this country. We do not hear about those names. I don't want to deal with the Burnhams, and everybody knows about them. But the ordinary African, the Africans in this country gave 217 years of free labor to make this country possible. The Africans of this country transformed swamp